Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Shaun Clowes with us. Shaun, thanks for coming on the show.
Morning, Bronson. Great to be here.
Absolutely. You say good morning because you're in Australia. It's actually the end of my work day, so we had to pick a time late in my day to make the time zones work. But thank you so much for coming on the show. And you are currently the senior product manager at Atlassian, a company that has a few wins under their belt. And you focus a considerable amount of your energy on growth hacking. So I think it's going to be kind of a perfect conversation that we have today where you're doing growth hacking for a company that is just acquiring users like crazy. But first, tell us, what is Atlassian? Tell us about maybe some of your more well-known products.
Sure. So Atlassian is an Australian software company, as you mentioned. What we do is we make tools that help product teams in any given company plan, build, and launch software. So we're most famous for our two tools, probably Jira, which is our bug tracker or issue tracker, and Confluence, which is our team collaboration and knowledge sharing platform. And also we have another quite major product called Greenhopper, which is an agile planning tool, which is used by agile teams.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you all have had, like I said earlier, just an incredible amount of growth as a company. I don't know what you guys disclose in terms of numbers, but give us some numbers to give us an idea of how big you guys are in terms of staff or revenue or capital raise. I think you guys just closed a round, or users. Well, what can you tell us about the size of Atlassian?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've definitely been growing pretty incredibly. So we've been around since 2002, so we're probably not really what you'd call a young company. We were founded with credit card debt, the traditional bootstrapping approach to the world. But we've been profitable for 40 quarters since, so that's 10 years since. We have over 25,000 customers in 130 countries. We're growing revenue at over 35% year on year. We've exceeded $100 million a year in our bookings. We have over 450 staff. The growth rates are astonishing. I mean, when I joined just a little while ago, there were half as many staff as there are now. So, the whole story of hockey stick growth, basically.
Yeah, no, it's quite a story. And in a minute, we're going to talk about how you actually growth hack at Atlassian, because that's going to be really interesting seeing how you're promoting that growth. But before we do that, I want to talk about growth hacking kind of in general, because like we were saying before the show, not many people can talk about it philosophically. They can tell you how they're doing it for their product, but they can't really zoom back and talk about it as a whole. And that's why I want to dig into this a little bit. So in your opinion, how do you define growth hacking? What is it?
Sure. In my mind, growth hacking is a really explicit search for product features on one hand or acquisition channels on the other that must increase growth, that must lead to a form of growth. And when I say growth, I mean it could be any combination of the number of users, the engagement of those users, or the revenue per users. And what I like to think about when it comes to growth hacking is the rigor of it all, right? It really is a process. And it should be reproducible, and it should be something that you can develop as a core competency. It's not a series of, tactics or, I don't know. It's not a series of just, ways to game systems or to take advantage of loopholes, etc. So we think about it as a rigorous scientific process as well, which is that it's extremely data driven. It's not really about opinion. I mean, to some degree, the growth hacks that you develop are part of the process of your understanding of your process of understanding a user.
So it kind of sounds like when you talk about a process, it reminds me of like the scientific method. There's a method to it that you kind of run things through. And yeah, you might have results as the end product of an individual experiment, but there was a process that led to that experiment. It's not just about the end results being, applied wherever you want, however you want, without understanding how you got there.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly particularly how we do it here. We literally, everything that we do has a hypothesis. So it is literally the scientific method that you're talking about. So what will happen is we will use various data, right? So data is both the beginning and the end of the process. So you use the data that you have about customers and their behavior and their interests and what they want, and you use that to form a series of hypotheses that you think might lead to growth in number of users, engagement, or revenue. And then you execute that experiment, and most of the time it doesn't work. Right? So it does not prove your hypothesis. It doesn't even necessarily disprove your hypothesis because most of the time when you execute an experiment, you don't get a result at all. You don't get a statistically significant result,
Hmm.
and that's frustrating. But on the other hand, it's better to know that when you do get a result, it's a rigorous process. You absolutely know that the results are real. And what's even better is that as you get better and better at this, you can execute more experiments. And so, what the competency that you're developing is not a series of tactics. It's the ability to do this repeatedly, and it becomes, quite a significant competitive advantage. I would argue because you can just move faster than everybody else.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I think this is going to be kind of obvious, but I want to ask it anyway. How is growth hacking different than, let's say, guerrilla marketing or even just normal product development? What's special about growth hacking?
Yeah, this is actually something that I really try and emphasize to people because a lot of the most, common anecdotes or the most outlandish anecdotes about growth hacking are all around user acquisition and using guerrilla marketing tactics to achieve, user acquisition. The problem with that is that what you're really doing is you're confusing the outcome of the activity with the activity itself. So the activity is growth hacking. The outcome is a set of guerrilla marketing tactics that some people have found, right? So the most obvious examples, the ones that people always mention, Airbnb using Craigslist, Zynga using Facebook. What they have done there is that they have growth hacked, but the growth hack that they've done is they have realized that their problem at that time, their growth constraint, was to do with acquisition. And then they've gone out, they've conducted a search, they've found a good way to acquire a lot of users very quickly, and they've executed that. But the fact that those tactics no longer work, is kind of the nature of the beast. You shouldn't go, okay, that means growth hacking has run its course. Like some people say, oh yeah, people have tried all these tactics now, they're spamming everybody, etc. But just because those tactics don't work anymore doesn't mean that tomorrow we won't see a whole bunch of amazing, even better acquisition growth hacks because it's the search, not the destination. There, and I think that. But the other thing to emphasize there is that if you look at guerrilla marketing tactics, then that's all about cheap user acquisition, right? Reaching a target audience, potential target audience, cheaply, preferably for free, usually by exploiting some loophole somewhere. And that's cool, but you can growth hack at any point in the funnel. And the focus is really on acquisition, and particularly in the startup community, the focus is quite wholesalely on acquisition. But if you look at the other places, activation, retention, revenue, referral, then all of those are great candidates too. And for some people, that's actually where their problem lies. Like if you look, I mean, you've probably heard Aaron Battalion, who was like one of the founders of Living Social. He's talked a lot about the fact that they acquired 1 million users, with no great difficulty, and then went, what do we do with them?
Hmm.
Right? So their growth problem was absolutely not getting users. It was taking them to the activation, revenue, referral, retention stages. So you can definitely do more than just acquisition and guerrilla, marketing. And I guess the reason I also like to compare it and contrast it to normal development is that I think that I've kind of mentioned it once already, but growth hacking is a very explicit search for growth avenues, right? Either through channels or product features that cause people to like your stuff more, right? Traditional product development, if you boil it down, is all about, and people will normally say this, it's about solving customer pain or about solving user pain. But the problem is that solving a user's pain, building a feature that solves a user's pain, doesn't guarantee that anyone will ever use it or ever see it. And in fact, it's possible that, and certainly in a lot of cases, a lot of features are never used. So you may be solving one person's pain, but in fact, you're introducing pain for a whole bunch of other people who have no idea what this additional widget is that's sitting there on their screen. Right? You're making it worse for a bunch of other people by complicating it. You kind of see growth hacking as the explicit and scientific section of that. And I also think it's kind of weird when you look at this. I think we're looking at this with hindsight now. I certainly think we are here at Atlassian, which is that you look back on the agile movement and you go, okay, that's obviously awesome, right? It's much better to be able to iterate quickly and to deliver what customers want and be sure it's what they want, right? And I feel a little bit that way about growth hacking, I look back and I go, I can't believe that weren't explicitly looking for ways to grow the number of users, revenue, engagement, right? Like, why was it nobody's job to do that? Clearly that's something that we all should be doing.
No, those are phenomenal points. I hope people just go back and listen to the last 5 minutes over and over and over, because I think you've summed up growth hacking and comparing it to the scientific method as well as anybody could. I think you've hit upon the heart of what growth hacking is, and I think you're absolutely right. It's not going away. Like, I can't possibly imagine a future where someone is not in charge of growth at any meaningful company. I mean, why would we ever return back to waterfall development? Why would we ever return back to not growth hacking and actually thinking about our funnel in very scientific ways? It would be returning to the dark ages, which would make no sense whatsoever. So I agree 100% with you there. Let me ask you this. When does it make sense to try growth hacking? People listening to this, when should they try it? When should they stay on the sidelines?
Yeah, this is one of those things that people often ask, and ask me, and ask at every given conference and stuff. And I think the standard answer, the playbook answer, is that you have to achieve product market fit before you can really do this. Because up until that moment, what would you achieve? You might be acquiring people or getting them to do whatever it is you're asking them to do, but you still won't have something that they desire, and you can't really do anything from there. But I would say that as soon as you've achieved product market fit, you really, really, really need to have somebody who, at least part-time, is thinking about this, because your problem, as I've mentioned already, right, your problem, once you put your problem in a framework, like, for example, where your growth problems are, then you can attack them. But up until that moment, you're kind of flying in the dark. You're going, oh, let's do a bit of work here, let's do a bit of work here, let's do a bit of work there. And you're never really sure if, in fact, you're pulling in opposite direction with your initiatives going. I'd say that growth hacking, at least as a part-time, thing, should be something you look at very early on, as soon as you're sure you've got something people desire.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this. How does growth hacking actually work in terms of leveraging it? Talk to us about that process a little bit.
Okay, cool. Yeah, as I said, we kind of have a very explicit process here, and a very explicit framework for thinking about growth hacking here. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a breakdown of what that looks like.
Please.
So as I've said, basically growth hacking is the way we talk about it, an explicit search for growth avenues across different parts of the funnel. And so the first step is basically understanding where you're going to get bang for your buck. So what you need to be doing is you need to understand your funnel, whatever it might be. Typically, you're trying to put your users in a series of states. So in other words, you might want to move them from having just signed up to having achieved the best features of your software, having used the best features of your software. Then from there you can get them to refer somebody, if that might be your current search for growth. So once you understand where you could get your bang for buck, then you have to use all of the data available to you. And so in this area, kind of growth hacking is, as you were putting it earlier, right? It's a no-brainer, because what we're saying is, we're in a big data world. We're in a big data, agile development, lean startup world, and growth hacking brings all of that awesome stuff together and lets us really leverage it and make it something actionable. So in this case, what we're doing, we understand whatever our problem is. We take all the data we have available to us, every single bit of analytics we can get our hands on, crunch it through all the machine learning and all that cool stuff that everybody's really into right now. And then that gives us an understanding, or at least a set of hypotheses about what it is that's stopping people from getting from that state to that state. Then we try and execute as many different tests as we possibly can. So in our case, we'll try and generate, 20, 30, 40 different hypotheses. And then you just want to execute them as quickly as you can. So you want to build something to test the hypotheses. And then you want to run A/B test, multivariate test, whatever it is, whatever type of testing takes your fancy. And then you want to execute all of those and let the data talk for itself. And indeed, when you really also want to be sure that you're, how do I put this? You really want to be, when you want to be as, it's not a good way to say it. So really what you want to do is you want to try and get any result. Kind of the way I think about it is any result is a good result, other than no result at all. So when you're executing your experiments, if you have 20 or 30 of them, right, you want those experiments to be reasonably I guess maybe forceful is a way to put it. If you believe something to be true, then you want to be testing it, in the most obvious to the user way you possibly can, right? You really
Okay,
want
I
to get it
gotcha.
right in front of the user, right in front of them,
Yeah.
because it would be better for you to see that users hate it, and that it clearly gives you the opposite result of what you're looking for, than it would be to see that it does nothing at all, right? You don't get any sort of it does not prove or disprove the hypothesis. So yeah,
So
and then the one other thing you need to do, which in order to truly be rigorous about this, is that you need to be sure that you don't just measure the very immediate outcome, which is something that I see people often do, right? So they go, okay, I want to drive people to refer, let's say they say, I want people to click my email button, which will share something in my product with some other person over email, and then I'm going to spam that person, and then, I'm going to put a little thing in the footer like Hotmail did. It's going to be, P.S. I love you, blah, and it's going to be great, right?
mhm.
And that's okay. It might well be great and it might well work, but you need to be very careful when you're executing experiments like that you're not measuring the direct outcome, which is the use of that feature. Because if you force people hard enough, they will do it because they don't have a choice to do it, but they might well hate you for it, right?
Yep.
So you always have to have a series of other things that preferably are as objective as you possibly can, that will tell you if you've in fact killed you know killed the result, rather than getting the positive result you're hoping for, even though it
Yeah.
looks like you might have achieved it.
And you have to
Yeah.
see kind of how different parts of the funnel interact with each other, because yeah, you may force them to use that feature, but then your revenue might plummet. So yeah, you got one number to go up and to the right, and another one that's also very important to go down and to the right. And so it's
Yeah.
always a balancing act, and really looking at the whole funnel as one big equation and seeing how everything affects everything, not just
Yeah.
the immediate thing right in front of you, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I guess to some degree, I think that the funnel does not capture one thing, but at least the B2C funnel that everybody talks about, which is the idea of happiness, right? So I understand that there's the point of retention, and retention might be seen to a degree as happiness, but you need to be very careful that you have some idea of what you think a regular user's behavior is. Right? And if you do have an idea of what a regular user's behavior is, then you can compare apples to apples.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, then even the funnel and cohort analysis can hide reasonably significant problems, because it's from one state to another. So you do need to be careful that you're not, in fact, people who are already in the state you want them to, causing them to regress back,
Mm-hmm.
up the funnel. So yeah, that's a
Yeah, no, it
challenge.
makes a lot of sense. Now let's dive into some specifics about how you've actually applied growth hacking to Atlassian a little bit. First, you mentioned this a little bit, but does growth hacking, in your opinion, work on B2B products? Because that's what Atlassian is. I mean, it's a whole suite of B2B products. Does it work in that context as well as B2C products? Is it the same? Is it totally different? How do you kind of see that?
Yeah. The answer, I mean, the first answer is yes, it definitely works. The challenge is that we're still kind of struggling to understand all of the implications of growth hacking in B2B, because so if you think about what the difference is, that there are two main differences for us, and the first one is that you've added a whole nother dimension. So in a traditional B2C product, your goal is to get the user, that one person, from one state to another,
Uh-huh.
right? In our case, our goal is to get a set of people, who are inside a company to like our stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there might be one decision maker and three users, or three decision makers and or 10 people or 100 people. And so the question is, how do so that level of interaction actually makes it quite a lot more complex to understand what it is that makes people happy and drives growth. And in our case, we actually have it even a little bit harder, because we have a series of products, like a suite of products, Confluence, Jira, Greenhopper, etc. So it's not even necessarily clear, when a user is working with a software, what they're here for. I mean, are they here for collaboration, or are they here for issue tracking, or are they here for agile planning? So that adds a whole bunch of other dimensions. But if you look at this from the alternative side, which is that when you have these ambiguities, right, that's where the gold lies, right? Like to a degree, when there is this confusion about all these problems, if you can answer these questions, then you're almost certain to find a pot of gold. on the other side of it. You're almost certain to find great growth hacks.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So it does work with B2B. It has a new set of questions that have to be answered, but there's a lot of room for growth because there's questions that have to be answered. No, I totally agree there. Now, give me some specifics. What kinds of growth hacking do you find yourself applying at Atlassian? And maybe you can even give us specific anecdotes like, hey, with this product, I tried this, this happened. With that product, I tried that, that happened. Talk me through some of the things you've done there.
Sure, sure. So my team, specifically my growth hacking team, we are specifically looking at in-product related experiments. So basically, this is at the point of the funnel after a company has signed up to try out a hosted version of the software. We do have other people who are doing, more experiments higher up the funnel, acquisition, etc. But because we're inside the software, most of our experiments are around trying to ensure that those new users who've come in to try our software, that they understand it, that they become engaged, and that they stay active with us over a period of time. Basically, that they remain our customer. And also we look at ways to encourage them to try other things that we might offer that might be useful for them, or get other people inside their company to want to use our software, right, to make the collaboration platform expand.
Yeah.
So if we look at this from the engagement front, then like I said, we try and be rigorous. So what we use is a mathematical model. So I mentioned machine learning earlier. And what we do is we use a mathematical model of all the events that occur in the first 7 days that somebody is using our software. And what that model does is it predicts for us, it gives us a number between 0 and 1, that this person will remain our customer for a long period of time.
Based on their actual events they trigger through their activity. Okay,
exactly.
So if you get like 0.8, they're probably going to stay around for a long time. If they get 0.1, they're probably not.
Yes, absolutely, right.
Okay.
And so the advantage of this model is that this gives us an extremely objective way to measure the outcome of what it is that we do. Because basically what happens is when we run an experiment, we can generate this number for the people who saw the experiment and the people who did not see the experiment. If the number is higher for the people who saw the experiment, then that means more of them will remain our customer for a longer period of time. And the natural implication of that is not just that they'll remain our customer, which is great, but it's actually that you have to assume that people who are going to stay with you longer like your software more, right? So the goal here is, in fact, to make people love your software, to make really great, engaging software. The way to measure it just happens to be that they'll remain your customer for a long period of time. And this is really objective. So that means that pretty much any given experiment that we run can be measured using this model. I mean, there are some types of experiments that doesn't make any sense, but this means that there's no opinion in the outcome of our discussions about whether or not an experiment worked or not. But looking at some, anecdotes, to give you some anecdotes of things.
Let me ask a few follow-up questions, and then we'll get to anecdotes, because I think what you just said is so interesting. I want to dive in there for a second. So one thing this does is, it seems like it really shortens the time frame needed to know if something was successful, because in a sense, you already have historic data with that 0 to 1 number that you're using. You don't have to wait for months of this new feature being out to know if it's successful. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. So in our case, we would probably develop an experiment. Most experiments would be developed in about 4 hours, right? Between deciding what we're going to do and having it built. Then deployment is pretty much instantaneous. And then basically what happens is that model, as you know, takes 7 days to calculate, but periodically it can be calculated through the experiment. And then at the end of it, so it's all automated infrastructure, and we have a experiment controller that we call Houston. And basically, if you go to Houston, it will show you the experiment, describes what the experiment was, and shows you all of the results. All the great mathematical stuff, standard deviation, mean, what events were triggered by who, did you manage to drive people to do what it was you were hoping they would do, and then also did that change the model, did that move the model? So it definitely makes it easier, and we don't have to wait a long period of time to know whether or not it was going to work.
Yeah, and you categorize this as machine learning, so I'm assuming it's actually taking data that's being produced and rolling it back into the equation on an ongoing basis. Is that right?
Yeah. So what happened was we have generated this model using a series of different machine learning algorithms over the historical period. So we have obviously a lot of data for historically whether or not people stayed our customer or not. And so we built this machine learning model, and then as time goes on, periodically we take all the new data that we have, we feed it back into the machine learning model and regenerate a new model, and then that model becomes the active model. Then we also have something that compares the real life, what actually happened, to what we predicted. And in some
so you can
cases,
see how far off you are.
yeah. Well, in some cases, what you find is that something you thought was not successful was. We haven't. Well, because I mean, realistically, the model is only X accurate. It's not.
Sure,
not
it's a model.
Yeah. And that's a good moment, right? When you happen to have an accidental success, right? That's a good moment too.
Yeah, well, the fact that you guys built in these fail safes to know if the model actually reflected reality, I mean, that's a level beyond what I've heard of companies doing, to be quite honest. I mean, I'm kind of surprised that, because, I think about machine learning a lot and I enjoy learning about it, but I've never had somebody come on the show and say, we're actually building machine learning into our growth hacking itself. Like, I think that's a new insight that I've never seen anybody do. And then the fact that you're comparing that machine learning algorithm to reality after the fact to see how well your process actually works. No wonder you guys are growing like you are. I mean, it makes sense now. All right, so let's get to some anecdotes. Tell us some of the anecdotes. What are maybe some of the biggest wins that you guys have had using these incredible tools?
Sure. We've had a lot of different kind of successes, but to some degree, I actually also really appreciate the counterintuitive results that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit more than necessarily the successes where you drove, some growth of X. And that's because, I think that it's amazing when you let the numbers speak for themselves. You often find out that all that you knew was wrong. So one that I thought I would mention was related to our agile planning product, which is Greenhopper. And Greenhopper, I mentioned slightly earlier, is basically an add-on to Jira, and it allows them to do this beautiful visual agile planning. And we know that lots of people love it, right? A lot of people buy it. It's got a very high rate of attachment to Jira. But we thought we would run an experiment anyway, where people who did not have Greenhopper, we ran an experiment where when they created a new project in Jira, we gave them the opportunity to see what the agile options would be if they had Greenhopper in the instance, and if they were interested, it said you can enable Greenhopper by doing the following things. Now, I mean, a lot of people might call that an upsell type of experiment. You're trying to encourage people to try something else. And to some degree, there's a lot of cynicism around that. And people are like, oh, you're just trying to, encourage people to do something. But the results of that experiment were completely the opposite of that, which is what I find so incredible. Because, yes, it is true that we got, basically we doubled the rate at which people would add Greenhopper onto Jira. So that's, an amazing outcome by itself. But the bit that I loved the most was that not only did we achieve that particular growth outcome, we turned out that mathematical model that I talked to you about, that engagement,
Mm-hmm.
it showed that we actually increased the likelihood that those people would stay with us by over 10%. Right?
Wow.
So basically, not only did I guess the way I think about this is that we were doing this, the customers who we did not tell about these things a disservice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I kind of feel like, I look at our behavior and go, we were kind of making life harder for them by not telling them about this. And it's obvious because once we told them, they liked us having told them, and they wanted to remain our customer.
You know what? That's such a good insight, because so many product people that are just like purists, they feel like anything you do to, increase growth, increase retention, that somehow it's always at the cost of the user, that everything has to be borderline spam. But it's not. So many times what we do to grow a product is actually what the end user wants us to do for other reasons than growing the product. So they go hand in hand more than people realize. For every path that spams users, there's a bunch of other companies that are doing things that are in line with the interests of their users, right?
Yeah, I completely agree, right? Almost all of the results that and the bit that I love about the model that I keep referring to is the fact that in the end, it is a proxy for people's engagement, how much they like the software. It's not a proxy for anything else, right? So if it goes up, then okay, there could be arguments that in some way there might be some landmine somewhere that you're stepping on as well, but most likely the answer is you have made them happier. So I guess my point of view is we should all stop making opinions and going, oh yeah, that is spam, that is too far, that is bad for the customer. And I'm like, let the customer speak for themselves. If you trust the data and you have a rigorous approach, then you don't need to ask these questions or second guess yourself. Just let the numbers speak.
Yeah.
So another interesting anecdote that I would share with you is around email. This is a little bit of a weird example, but I wanted to mention it because I was stunned by the outcome, which was a lot of people have had a lot of success with growth hacking and email. We haven't done very much of it here, but in one case we sent customers out an email that was telling them for their instance of whatever their products were. We gave them some statistics of how they'd been doing, the various actions that had been happening in their instance, and then we compared them. We said, compared to other people who are like you are 20% more active or 30% less this, or you might have seen these sorts of emails and they come from Salesforce, for example, does some of this, right? And we thought that, this might inspire people to try out things they hadn't previously used, right, which might be great. It also might inspire them to, inside their organization, drive up engagement and evangelize things inside their engagement. And we only sent this out to not very many people, and maybe a couple of thousand, and we included two big buttons at the bottom, right? This is a test. How much do you like it? Would you like to receive it again? Yes or no? And they were really big buttons. And what I couldn't believe was that, this email got an open rate of over 40%. So, I mean, unbelievable open rate for this out-of-the-blue email. And then 98% of people who clicked the button chose yes.
Wow.
So some people might say, oh yeah, spam, blah, 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 you're going to spam the customers. It turns out that their view of this was in fact exactly the opposite of that.
It's a feature.
Yeah, exactly right. And what's even better is that this email developed a life of its own. And some of our executives were in a presentation with a customer, in the next week, and that customer presented that email back to them. And said, this email is just the best thing ever. I'm so glad you guys have started sending it. And the executives are going, what email? We've never sent this email, right? Because it was just an experiment, right? So no one else had ever seen it before. It turns out that there are lots of cool things you can do that will make your customers very happy, I guess.
Yeah, I love the insight of letting the customers decide what works and what doesn't, and not having to preemptively handicap yourself because of bizarre views on what spam is.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's great. Now, let me ask you about something else. On your all's products, at least the ones I'm familiar with, I'm not familiar with all of them, but it seems like you're transparent with the prices. You can go and you can see how much things cost. Is that a part of your growth hack? Is that a tactic to let people feel at ease with coming on board?
Yeah, we've been around for a long time, and we've always kind of had full price transparency. So certainly at the time when we first started doing that, enterprise software companies kept everything as big a secret as they possibly could, and I guess to some degree today a lot of them still do. But at that time, the open approach to pricing and the really quite modest approach to pricing made it possible for lots of small teams to use our software, which was a huge growth improvement for us. But where it really exploded was in 2009, and that was when we introduced our $10 for 10 users for a perpetual license, where we donate the whole $10 to charity license. And we had expected at that time to sell $25,000 worth of those licenses in a 5-day period, which was our intention to run that promotion for. In the end, we achieved $25,000 in 18 hours rather than 5 days. We didn't cancel that particular promotion, and it's been running ever since. You can still buy a license, $10 for 10 users, perpetual. We still donated all to Room to Read. We gave them over $2.5 million last year. What this does is this gives all these small teams, these smaller teams, the advantage, the ability to use our software, and without friction. They can, even if they're in a small team in a big organization, they can take it on without needing to go through procurement and all these other processes that make that very difficult, and they can really just get things done, be successful.
That's great. Yeah. Now, not only is the pricing transparent, but the products themselves seem to be self-serve. You don't have to do a lot to get them installed and get them up and running. And Atlassian's president has said, quote, really good white papers will sell the product, no need for a form. I like that quote. Tell me, what do you think he means by that? Because I think there's something insightful going on there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the industry are into this thing right now where, you'll have some white paper or some ebook or something, and then you'll have an email form in front of it so that you can get their email and then kind of spam them forever to try and encourage them to, convert or to do something with you, do something further with you. I think our point of view is very different, which is that what we are trying to do is build a really great software, right? And the software that we build is to help people build really great software. So our point of view is that our learnings, we're trying to be the best we can at what we can do. So we want to share that knowledge with everybody else because that will help them be successful, and that will obviously want them to consider our products so they can be even more successful. So it's more along the lines of, I was thinking about this, and I think that this is about company market fit rather than product market fit. This is about the fact that Atlassian lives the life of its customers, right? And so we are trying to align with them in every way, in terms of encouraging their success through sharing our methodologies with them, and then taking the best of the industry's methodologies and putting it back into our processes and our software as well. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship going on there.
Yeah. Now, Forbes last year published an article, and they had I think kind of a humorous quote in the middle of it about the Atlassian products. It says, "Their products may not win any design contest, but they are so easy to use that they're flooding the world's businesses with collaborative software." So let me ask you first, do you agree with that assessment, that they're not going to win design awards, but they are that easy to use? Do you agree with that, or is that just wrong?
Yeah, I mean, Jira and Confluence have been around for a long time, so, I can understand why people would feel that way. There certainly was a feeling of a bit older, but, we have quite a stellar design and UX team here now. So I think if you were to look at some of the later stuff, Jira 6, Confluence 5.1, I think most people would take that back. But you're right, there has been a journey to modernize and really make them beautiful as well as functional.
Yeah, but you guys grew a lot even before the UX team was really in place there. So let me ask you this. Do you think that function should trump design for the sake of growth?
Yeah, that one's really interesting. I kind of would say that it's a little bit the opposite, right?
Okay.
And what I mean that is because really beautiful design is about helping a user engage with the software in a way that feels perfectly natural, and so in a way that means they're inextricably linked together rather than contradictory. So I think that really good design leads people to become so engaged that those later portions of the funnel are like obvious, right? Of course I'm going to be retained because I love this thing. It helps me achieve exactly what I want. Of course I'm going to pay you for it because this is so awesome. Like, I cannot imagine why you're only charging me X dollars for it. And I'm going to refer it to other people because this is so awesome. It's changed my life, I'm going to want to post it on Twitter. You're not going to have to build some integration which spams all my Twitter followers, right? Like, I'm going to want to post that stuff. So I think that I would say that no. Basically, what I'm trying to say is no. I think design really is very important, and it's getting more and more important, right? Because now we're moving towards a world where people expect beautiful, great interaction and software to know what they want it to do. But I, on this particular question, I do think it's important to distinguish growth hacking, the activities you conduct in growth hacking versus a real product or what would be a final feature. So when we talk about design and growth hacking, I always say that the goal is to test your hypothesis, whatever it is. So if your hypothesis is about some particular button somewhere in the user interface that will lead into some path of behavior, then the very first thing you need to do is test that button. And I don't, and a lot of people are quite into should the button be blue or red and all that sort of stuff. And my point of view is that most of the time that button will never get clicked anyway, right? So I really don't mind if it's blue, red, if it looks exactly like all the other buttons in the interface. I think when you're in the experiment phase and you're testing these ideas, you don't need to have a beautiful, amazing, perfectly rounded edges design before you can test the idea, because most ideas just won't work. So it's important to be efficient with what you're doing rather than getting too deep into it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So let me ask you this. Have there been any lessons you learned the hard way? I know as you go through this process, there's going to be some things you try, and not only does the experiment work or not work, you actually learn how to do growth hacking itself better because of a mistake. What have you guys learned the hard way there?
Yep, definitely, definitely. One I kind of was just referring to then, which is the fact that when you are conducting this search, your goal is always to test. I refer to it as the kernel of truth, the very center of what it is you believe it is the user's behavior. So if your thought is that people want to, let's say it's in Jira, and you think that, okay, people will like Jira more if when they first create a project in Jira, they get the opportunity to choose a workflow for that project, and then the ability to choose what the steps are in that workflow, right? You might believe that to be true. Now, if you do believe that to be true, then the first step of your hypothesis is actually that somebody, when they click the create project thing, that if you offered them a button or a list of available workflows, that they will choose one, right? So your test should always be just that. Your first test should always be the minimum necessary to answer that question, because, as I said, most of the time the user's not going to do it, or they're not going to care about it there. And if that happens to you, then you have two choices here. Either you accept that your hypothesis was wrong, which is not necessarily true. If they didn't click it, you don't know one way or another. But then you can conduct a search for where they might want that feature. So you can go, okay, maybe I'm still right. So you might go, okay, I'm going to put that select a workflow button on the project page, or I'm going to put it here, or I'm going to email people and say, now that you've created a new project, would you like to consider one of the following workflows, right? So you can do the search for where they might care. And then eventually, after you find that, no, they really don't care at all, then you can ditch it, or you might have found a great place. So it's much better to test really what you're trying to get out there. The other thing I think that I would, and I really emphasize to people, and sometimes I really emphasize this to product managers, because they have a very, and we were actually referring to this earlier, but people, in our experience with our experiments, people are much less sensitive than we think they are, right? There's always this view that, if you put a button there, people are going to hate it. It's going to cause them to write us hate mail. It's going to be disastrous. If you send them that email, they're going to be like, oh man, those guys always spam me. There's always this pushback of that isn't a beautiful design. That isn't a complete feature. That isn't a whatever. But, in our experience, as I said, the vast majority of things are not noticed by users at all. At times we've even put things in the very center of the screen in a dialog box, and users will literally click around it. They will. It's almost like they do not even see it. They're so directed towards the way they always work with the software that they just don't feel it, and they don't respond.
Yeah.
So when you're experimenting, you really need to be bold. And you need to try extreme versions of your ideas. And as I said earlier, it's better to get a fail than to get no results at all. So, for example, if your hypothesis is that a user must do something in order to gain a bit of knowledge that will cause them to be happy, then forcing them to do that, some people will argue is oh no, we really should not force the customer, but either you believe it or you don't. You can't have it both ways. And so your experiment may as well be the extreme version. You may as well force them to do it. Because if it turns out that is a bad idea and customers absolutely hate it, that experiment will fail and you'll never make that mistake ever again. But if it turns out that that's exactly what you need the customer to do, then that will be a huge success, and forever after you'll get the benefit of that success.
Yeah.
That's the real upside of growth hacking, right? You pay for a failure exactly once, and you get the benefit of successes infinitely.
Yeah, that's the quote of the interview right there. And I love your second point, be extreme, be bold. And with your first point, it almost made me think, we have MVP, minimal viable product. It's almost like MVF, minimal viable feature, just so we can test it to see. It's almost like bringing, the company as a whole into the growth hacking mindset itself. What's the smallest amount of resource I can put into this test to get the essence of what I'm looking for, is kind of the way you put it there. So I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah, Bronson, quite literally that is our goal here at Atlassian, to bring growth hacking to every single team, right? To bring every single team the idea that, what we do should be validated in some way, and growth hacking is a great way to validate things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Shaun, this has been an incredible interview. I've got one last question for you here. It's kind of the high level fortune cookie question. You can be vague if you want, or take it any direction you want. But what's the best advice that you have for any startup that's trying to grow?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's kind of common advice these days. It's a little bit of a, chestnut, but, I think that what you really want to be doing is optimizing the rate at which you can validate your ideas. And we've been talking about it throughout this interview.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are a lot of opinions, and in startups, early stage startups, there are a hell of a lot of opinions, but it's really critical to make some attempts, whatever that attempt might be, to validate that they have some basis in fact, because in our growth hacking experience, right, they just don't work. They're just not right. It's so unfortunate that you might think that you can think like a customer, but you just can't, because you're not in their shoes. You can try, but you need to be sure, and you need to try it. And I think that what's startling about this is that if you make this a core competency, then what you're actually doing is you're optimizing your ability to optimize. And that's a really, I know that's meta, or but really, you're optimizing your ability to optimize the output of your work, because if you get to the point where it's a core competency of everything that you do in development, in support, in marketing, if it's a core competency to test your, in some easy way, quickly, what it is you think to be true, then you guarantee that all the horses are pulling in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You cheaply and quickly guarantee that. And once you do that, you get like 10 times the bang for your buck as a traditional organization does, where everybody's pulling in different directions and no one's even sure that that's the right thing. 2 steps forward, 3 steps back sometimes, that sort of thing. So you can be way more effective than other organizations can be, and and it's a bit like if you talk about like continuous integration and like releasing daily, right? If you talked about that sort of idea 5 years ago, people would have laughed you out of the room, right? They're like, you're kidding, right? We release once a year, and it's a big bang release and it's all of that stuff. But once you get better at it, you become better at it. So once it becomes a competency, then it becomes something that you do without thinking. That's so fast and easy that you don't consider it. So when you're releasing every day, there is no friction to releasing every day. And it's the same with validating your ideas. Once you reach the point where it's something that you always do, it takes very little time to find some way to validate it. And you get the best possible outcome that way.
Yeah, well, that's incredible advice to end on. Again, Shaun, thank you so much for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
Thank you very much, Bronson. Pleasure.